Excellent. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the sort of first/second Cosy Literature stream with me and Amy. After the Poe toasting that we did a few weeks ago, I was chatting to Amy and we thought it'd be nice to actually do some more kind of readings of proper horror literature, just in itself, because, you know, horror originally was a literary genre, and obviously sort of the film industry has kind of taken it on from there. But I think it's always interesting to go back to some of the texts. So that's why Amy and I are going to be kind of starting a new regular series. So every fortnight we'll have a reading of some stories by sort of horror authors. So we'll start with, I'm babbling. So we'll alternate between Proper Horror Show's channel, where we're guests tonight, and Amy's channel. So every 2 weeks we'll switch between the two. And so tonight, because this week is Lovecraft, the theme for Proper Horror Show's streams this month is Lovecraftian horror. We're going to be reading some Lovecraft short stories. But yeah, the overall idea of these streams is just to kind of help people understand and hear a little bit more about, you know, the stories and the people behind the stories that have influenced the sort of movie genre that we all rather enjoy. And so with that, I will now pass over to Amy, who's going to give a bit of an introduction to who H.P. Lovecraft was, and then read the first of our stories tonight, which is the music of Erich Zann. Oh, you're on mute, Amy.
Good start. I thought I would keep the biography of Lovecraft short, because the amount of secondary literature on Lovecraft and and his biography and his work is just this sort of a babbling chaos. It's such a vast, incomprehensible body of work that is as much of a mythos as what he wrote himself. So he was born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, to a sort of New England family, and throughout his life he saw himself as sort of displaced sort of minor gentry, was quite proud of his lineage. However, he grew up with quite a lot of financial difficulties. His granddad was a businessman who created a lot of wealth and lost a lot of wealth multiple times, and his dad died while he was quite young of syphilis. So him and his mum and his aunt or his grandmother grew up together, brought him up, and he, at quite a young age, he had a nervous breakdown, and his mum herself had a nervous breakdown and died in an asylum. But that meant he didn't go to school, and he spent a lot of time just at home reading on his own. So he was a very extremely well-read man, but as a result of this sort of the seclusion, the lack of socialization, ended up being really quite unemployable throughout his entire life. So the poverty essentially lasted until his death. He was quite involved in amateur journalism as well, prior to writing short stories. I started writing short stories around the early. It really picked up in the early 1920s, and which point in 1924 he moved to New York City to marry a woman whose name was Sonia Haft Green, who was a Jewish woman who was 7 years his senior, and she was quite a successful small business owner herself, but she her I think it was a hat company that went bust, and they lived in. She went down into moved away in America to pursue another career, earning money, and he kind of lived in poverty in New York until he was eventually invited back to his Providence home, And it was after his return from New York that in 1926 is when the work that we sort of characteristically Lovecraftian was started. That's when he really came into his own as a writer around 1926. That was when the Cthulhu, Call of the Cthulhu was first written. And so essentially the work that we associate mainly with Lovecraft, it was when his style was really distilled, and then he continued to write, having money issues, but continuing to write for fiction, for what were considered pulp magazines, but also non-fiction as well for some conservative journals and news outlets for the rest of his life until he died. Quite young of cancer. I think he died in 1937. Yeah, and died in 1937 of cancer. So quite a tragic life, and I don't think he was really truly recognised until after his death. And he's definitely going through a bit of a renaissance now. But at the time, he was a huge letter writer, and despite being quite a recluse, was in contact with a lot of his literary contemporaries within his genre, and he left a huge body of work of letters from his correspondence as well.
I have positioned the laptop slightly longer than arm's length away, so that's why I'm lunging forward. Thank you. That was really interesting, because I knew a bit about that. I knew that he'd sort of struggled with money, but I hadn't realised particularly the sort of nervous breakdown in his childhood, and then that kind of quite isolated experience growing up. So yeah, I think you can sort of see some of those sort of solitariness come through in some of his protagonists from the little I've read of his so far.
Yeah, they're definitely sort of quite ineffectual men. A lot of them are very bookish, and I do think that a lot of that comes from the influence of Poe. I don't think it's entirely and I think it serves a role in the narrative, but I don't think it is entirely autobiographical. But I do think there is an element of that.
For sure. Lovely. Would you like to read the first story?
I was going to say, with regards to his political beliefs, which people are very interested in now, both on the left and the right. I think the right like to claim him as one of their own, and the left, there's been a bit of a revival in like Lovecraftian style literature in weird fiction amongst left, like extremely left-wing people like China Mayville and Jeff Vandermeer. But throughout his life, his beliefs and his political and philosophical outlooks like changed dramatically. He was quite, although he remained quite elitist and a materialist throughout his life. His political and philosophical beliefs did vary greatly.
Okay, that is worth bearing in mind. I'm going to briefly touch on sort of certainly the leftist response to him a bit later.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of notes on that took me by surprise. So including Cthulhu entering the political arena of America in 2016, but we'll discuss that a bit later. But yes. I think
so we're going to get on with the first story.
I was going to say, I've read it once and I'd love to hear it again. So Amy's now going to read The Music of Erich Zann.
If I can find it. I have examined the maps of the city with the greatest care, yet have never managed to find the Rue d'Arciel. These maps have not been modern maps alone, for I know that names change. I have, on the contrary, delved deeply into all the antiquities of the place, and have personally explored every region of whatever name which could possibly answer to the street I knew as the Rue d'Arciel. But despite all I have done, it remains a humiliating fact that I cannot find the house, the street, or even the locality where, during the last months of my impoverished life as a student of metaphysics at the university, I heard the music of Erich Zann. That my memory is broken, I do not wonder, for my health, physical and mental, was gravely disturbed throughout the period of my residence in the Rue d'Orsay, and I recall that I took none of my few acquaintances there. But that I cannot find the place again is both singular and perplexing, for it was within a half hour's walk of the university and was distinguished by peculiarities which would hardly be forgotten by anyone who had been there. I have never met a person who has seen the Rue d'Orsay. The Rue d'Orsay lay across a dark river bordered by precipitous, brick, blear-windowed warehouses and spanned a ponderous bridge of dark stone. It was always shadowy along the river, as if the smoke of neighbouring factories shut out the sun perpetually. The river is also odorous with evil stenches which I have never smelled elsewhere, and which may some day help me to find it, since I should recognise them at once. Beyond the bridge were narrow cobbled streets with rails, and then came the ascent, at first gradual, but incredibly steep as the Rue d'Orsay was reached. I have never seen another street as narrow and steep as the Rue d'Orsay. It was almost a cliff, close to all vehicles, consisting in several places of flights of steps, and ended at the top of a lofty ivied wall. Its paving was irregular, sometimes stone slabs, sometimes cobbles, and sometimes bare earth with struggling greenish-grey vegetation. The houses were tall, peak-roofed, incredibly old, and crazily leaning backward, forward, and sideways. Occasionally an opposite pair, both leaning forward, almost met across the street like an arch, and certainly they kept most of the light from the ground below. There were overhead bridges from house to house across the street. The inhabitants of that street impressed me particularly. At first I thought it was because they were all silent and reticent, but later decided it was because they were all very old. I do not know how I came to live on such a street, but I was not myself when I moved there. I had been living in many poor places, always evicted for want of money, until at last I came upon that tottering house in the Rue d'Orsay, kept by the paralytic Blondeau. It was the third house from the top of the street, and by far the tallest of them all. My house was on the 5th story, the only inhabited room there, since the house was almost empty. On the night I arrived, I heard strange music from the peaked garret overhead, and the next day asked old Blondeau about it. He told me it was an old German viol player, a strange, dumb man who signed his name Erich Zann, and who played evenings in a cheap theatre orchestra. Adding that Zann's desire was to play in the night after his return from the theatre was the reason he had chosen this lofty and isolated garret room, whose single gabled window was the only point on the street from which one could look over the terminating wall at the declivity and panorama beyond. Thereafter I heard Erich Zann every night, and although he kept me awake, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. Knowing little about myself, I was yet certain that none of his harmonies had any relation to music I had heard before, and concluded that he was a composer of highly original genius. The longer I listened, the more I was fascinated, until after a week I resolved to make the old man's acquaintance. One night, as he was returning from his work, I intercepted Zann in the hallway and told him that I would like to know him and be with him when he played. He was a small, lean, bent person with shabby clothes, blue eyes, grotesque, satyr-like face, and nearly bald head, and at my first words seemed both angered and frightened. My obvious friendliness, however, finally melted him, and he grudgingly motioned to me to follow him up the dark, creaking, rickety attic stairs. His room, one of only two in the steeply pitched garret, was on the west side, towards the high wall that formed the upper end of the street. Its size was very great, and seemed the greater because of its extraordinary bareness and neglect. Of furniture, there was only a narrow iron bedstead, a dingy washstand, a small table, a large bookcase, an iron music rack, and 3 old-fashioned chairs. Sheets of music were piled in disorder about the floor. The walls were of bare boards and had probably never known plaster, whilst the abundance of dust and cobwebs made the place seem even more deserted than inhabited. Evidently, Erich Zann's world of beauty lay in some far cosmos of the imagination. Motioning me to sit down, the dumb man closed the door, turned the large wooden bolt, and lighted a candle to augment the one he had brought with him. He now removed his vial from its moth-eaten covering, and taking it, seated himself on the least comfortable of the chairs. He did not employ the music rack, but offering no choice and playing from memory, enchanted me for over an hour with strains I had never heard before, strains which must have been of his own devising. To describe their exact nature was impossible for one unversed in music. They were a kind of fugue, with recurrent passages of the most captivating quality, but to me they were notable for the absence of any of the weird notes I had overheard in my room below on other occasions. Those haunting notes I had remembered, and had often hummed and whistled inaccurately to myself, so that when the player at length laid down his bow, I asked him if he would render some of them. As I began my request, the wrinkled satyr-like face lost the bored placidity it had possessed during the playing, and seemed to show the same curious mixture of anger and fright which I had noticed when I first accosted the old man. For a moment I was inclined to use persuasion, regarding rather lightly the whims of senility, and even tried to awaken my host's weirder mood by whistling a few of the strains which I had listened the night before. But I did not pursue this course for more than a moment, for when the dumb musician recognised the whistled air, his face grew suddenly distorted with an expression wholly beyond his analysis, and his long, cold, and bony right hand reached out to stop my mouth and silence the crude imitation. As he did this, he further demonstrated his eccentricity by casting a startled glance toward the lone curtained window, as if fearful of some intruder, a glance doubly absurd since the garret stood high and inaccessible over the adjacent roofs, this window being the only point on the steep street, as the concierge had told me, from which one could see over the wall of that summit. The old man's glance brought Blando's remarks to my mind, and with certain capriciousness, I felt a wish to look out over the wide and dizzying panorama of moonlit roofs and city lights beyond the hilltop, which all the dwellers in the Rue d'Ossio, only this crabbed musician could see. I moved towards the window and would have drawn aside the nondescript curtains when a frightened rage, even greater than before the dumb lodger, was upon me again, this time motioning with his head towards the door as he nervously strove to drag me thither with both hands. Now thoroughly disgusted with my host, I ordered him to release me and told him I would go at once. His clutch relaxed, and he saw my disgust and offence. His own anger seemed to subside. He tightened his relaxing grip, but this time in a friendly manner, forcing me into a chair, then with an appearance of wistfulness crossing to the littered table, where he wrote many words with a pencil in the laboured French of a foreigner. The note which he finally handed me was an appeal for tolerance and forgiveness. Zann said that he was old, lonely, and afflicted with strange fears and nervous disorders connected with his music and with other things. He had enjoyed my listening to his music, and wished I could come again and not mind his eccentricities, but he could not play to another his weird harmonies, and could not bear hearing them from another, nor could he bear having anything in his room touched by another. He had not known until our hallway conversation that I could overhear his playing in my room, and now asked me if I would arrange with Blando to take a lower room where he could not hear him in the night. He would, he wrote, defray the difference in rent. As I sat deciphering the execrable French, I felt more lenient towards the old man. He was a victim of physical and nervous suffering, as was I, and my metaphysical studies had taught me kindness. In the silence there came a slight sound from the window. The shutter must have rattled in the night wind, and for some reason I started almost as violently as did Erich Zann. So when I had finished reading, I shook my host by the hand and departed as a friend. The next day, Blando gave me a more expensive room on the third floor, between the apartments of an aged moneylender and the room of a respectable upholsterer. There was no one on the fourth floor. It was not long before I found that Erich Zann's eagerness for my company was not as great as it had seemed while he was persuading me to move down from the fifth story. He did not ask me to call on him, and when I did call, he appeared uneasy and played listlessly. This was always at night. In the day he slept and would admit no one. My liking for him did not grow, though the attic room and weird music seemed to hold an odd fascination for me. I had a curious desire to look out of that window over the wall and down the unseen slope at the glittering roofs and spires which must lie outspread there. Once I went up to the garret during theatre hours, when Zann was away, but the door was locked. What I did succeed in doing was to overhear the nocturnal playing of the dumb old man. At first I would tiptoe onto my old 5th floor, and then I grew bold enough to climb the last creaking staircase to the Peak's garret. There in the narrow hall outside the bolted door with the covered keyhole, I often heard sounds which filled me with an indefinable dread, the dread of vague wonder and brooding mystery. It was not that the sounds were hideous, for they were not, but that they held vibrations suggesting nothing on this globe of earth, and that at certain intervals they assumed a symphonic quality which I could hardly conceive of as being produced by one player. Certainly, Erich Zann was a genius of wild power. As the weeks passed, the playing grew wilder, whilst the old musician acquired an increasing haggardness and furtiveness pitiful to behold. He now refused to admit me at any time, and shunned me whenever we met on the stairs. Then one night, as I listened at the door, I heard the shrieking viols swell to a chaotic babble of sound, a pandemonium which would have led me to doubt my own shaking sanity had there not come from behind that foul portal a piteous proof that the horror was real, the awful inarticulate cry which only a mute can utter, which rises only in moments of the most terrible fear or anguish. I knocked repeatedly at the door, but received no response. Afterward, I waited in the black hallway, shivering with cold and fear, till I heard the poor musician's feeble effort to rise from the floor by the aid of a chair. Believing him just conscious after a fainting fit, I renewed my rapping, at the same time calling out my name reassuringly. I heard Zann stumble to the window and closed both shutter and sash, then stumble to the door which he falteringly unfastened to admit me. This time, his delight at having me present was real, for his distorted face gleamed with relief while he clutched at his coat as a child clutches at its mother's skirts. Shaking pathetically, the old man forced me into a chair, whilst he sank into another, beside which his viol and bow lay carelessly on the floor. He sat for some time, inactive, nodding oddly, but having a paradoxical suggestion of intense and frightening listening. Subsequently, he seemed to be satisfied, and crossing to a chair by the table, wrote a brief note, handed it to me, and returned to the table, where he began to write rapidly and incessantly. The note implored me in the name of mercy, and for the sake of my own curiosity, to wait where I was while he prepared a full account in German of all the marvels and terrors which beset him. I waited, and the dumb man's pencil flew. It was perhaps an hour later, while I still waited, and while the old musician's feverishly written sheets still continued to pile up, that I saw Zann start as from the hint of a horrible shock. Unmistakably, he was looking at the curtained window and listening shudderingly. Then I half fancied I heard a sound myself. Though it was not a horrible sound, but rather an exquisitely low and infinitely distant musical note, suggesting a player in one of the neighbouring houses, or in some abode beyond the lofty wall over which I had never been able to look. Upon Zann the effect was terrible, for dropping his pencil suddenly he rose, seized his viol, and commenced to rend the night with the wildest playing I had ever heard from his bow save when listening at the barred door. It would be useless to describe the playing of Erich Zann on that dreadful night. It was more horrible than anything I had ever overheard, because I could now see the expression of his face, and could realize that this time the motive was stark fear. He was trying to make a noise, to ward something off, or to drown something out. What, I could not imagine, awesome though I felt it must be. The playing grew fantastic, delirious and hysterical, yet kept the last of the qualities of supreme genius which I knew this strange old man possessed. I recognized the air. It was a wild Hungarian dance popular in the theatres, and I reflected for a moment that this was the first time I had ever heard Zann play the work of another composer. Louder and louder, wilder and wilder, mounted the shrieking and whining of that desperate viol. The player was dripping with an uncanny perspiration and twisted like a monkey, always looking frantically at the curtained window. In his frenzied strains, I could almost see the shadowy satyrs and bacchanals dancing and whirling insanely through the seething abyss of clouds and smoke and lightning. And then I thought I heard a shriller, steadier note that was not from the viol, a calm, deliberate, purposeful, mocking note from far away in the west. At this juncture, the shutter began to rattle in a howling night wind, which had sprung up outside as if in answer to the mad playing within. Zann's screaming viol now outdid itself, emitting sounds I had never thought a viol could emit. The shutter rattled more loudly, unfastened, and commenced slamming against the window. Then the glass broke shiveringly under the persistent impacts, and the chill wind rushed in, making the candles sputter and rustling the sheets of paper on the table where Zann had begun to write out his horrible secret. I looked at Zann, and I saw that he was past conscious observation. His blue eyes were bulging, glassy and sightless, and the frantic playing had become blind, mechanical, unrecognizable orgy that no pen could ever suggest. A sudden gust, stronger than the others, caught up the manuscript and bore it towards the window. I followed the flying sheets in desperation, but they were gone before I reached the demolished panes. Then I remembered my old wish to gaze from this window, the only window in the Rue d'Orsay from which one might see the slope beyond the wall and the city outspread beneath. It was very dark, but the city's lights always burned, and I expected to see them there amidst the rain and the wind. And yet when I looked from that highest of all the gabled windows, looked while the candles sputtered and the insane viol howled with the night wind, I saw no city spread below, and no friendly lights gleaming from the remembered streets, but only the blackness of space, illimitable. Unimagined space alive with motion and music, and having no semblance of anything on earth. And as I stood there looking in terror, the wind blew out both the candles in that ancient peak's garret, leaving me in savage and impenetrable darkness, with chaos and pandemonium before me, and the demon madness of the night-baying viol behind me. I staggered back in the dark, without the means of striking a light, crashing against a table, overturning a chair, and finally groping my way to the place where the blackness screamed with shocking music. To save myself and Erich Zann, I could at least try, whatever the powers opposed to me. Once I thought some chill thing brushed me, and I screamed, but my scream could not be heard above that hideous viol. Suddenly out of the blackness, the madly soaring bow struck me, and I knew I was closer to the player. I felt a head touch the back of Zann's chair, then I found and shook his shoulder in an effort to bring him to his senses. He did not respond, and still the viol shrieked without slackening. I moved my hand to his head, whose mechanical nodding I was able to stop, and shouted in his ear that we must both flee from the unknown things of the night. But he neither answered me nor abated the frenzy of his unutterable music, while all through the garret strange currents of wind seemed to dance in the darkness and babble. When my hand touched his ear, I shuddered, though I knew not why. I knew not why till I felt the still face, the ice-cold, stiffened and breathing face, whose glassy eyes bulged uselessly into the void. And then, by some miracle finding the door and the large wooden bolt, I plunged wildly from that glassy-eyed thing in the dark, and from the ghoulish howling of that accursed viol whose furies increased even as I plunged. Leaping, floating, flying down those endless stairs through the dark house, racing mindlessly out into the narrow, steep, and ancient streets of steps and tottering houses, clattering down steps and over cobbles to the lower streets and putrid canyon-walled river, panting across the great dark bridge to the broader, healthier streets and boulevards we all know. All these are terrible impressions that linger with me, and I recall that there was no wind, and that the moon was out, and that all the lights of the city twinkled. Despite my most careful searches and investigations, I have never since been able to find the Rue d'Orsay, but I am not wholly sorry, either for this or for the loss of the undreamable abysses of the closely written sheets, which alone could have explained the music of Erich Zann.
I love that one.
Yes, it's definitely the most compact and I think well structured of his short stories.
Yes, it's that sort of there's no, I think there's no actual direct dialogue. Just looking back through it, but it's sort of it's a really small. What am I trying to say? In terms of what happens, very very little kind of concretely happens, but it's just this. The atmosphere is all there. It's all in that kind of creepy, unsettling. Sort of
I think how little happens in it. A man moves into a new flat, and then here's a man playing music and wants to hear him more, and then it's the end. I think it's quite apt for the story itself, because a lot of what we get with Lovecraft is about the fear of it, the excess of the universe, of the incomprehensible amount of what is out there by comparison to us. Whereas what we have with the music of Erich Zann, the horror is nothing. When he looks out of the window and he expects to see the twinkling sights of panorama of Paris, it's not what we don't see a monster that is so vast that it fills him with like existential dread in the way that a lot of his other protagonists see. We just see the blackness of space illimitable.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was something I was going to go on and briefly talk about, was that what is Lovecraftian horror? And it's, it's also, I saw someone in the chat had referred to it as cosmic horror as well, as another term for it at the moment. And it is that horror of the unknowable, the incomprehensible. He was interested in that kind of the forbidden knowledge of humans seeking stuff they shouldn't know, and that kind of that sort of the risk, I suppose, associated with seeking forbidden knowledge. And I mean, the other sort of themes that come up in his a lot, again, is that like madness, which, given the context of what happened to his mother and to himself as a young man, I think I'm sort of understanding perhaps a bit more about why people going out of their minds might feature quite so much in his writing. But it's, I think, that sort of theme of just looking into nothingness, and that nothingness being sort of so terrifying.
Especially when in its place he expected to see the city of Paris, which at the time, obviously we don't know when the story was written, and Lovecraft himself, I don't think he ever visited Europe or England, but at the time, the 19th and early 20th century, Paris was a cultural capital of the world. It was the center of the artistic and intellectual world. It was a symbol of human history and endeavors and achievement and human, with the end of the Second World War and all of the bloody revolutions of Europe. It was the center of suffering as we know it, of human material suffering, and to look over that, to expect to see that, and for that to no longer exist, the sort of something that's quite a big theme in Lovecraft is the futility of human endeavors.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I find that to be with the nothingness and the fact that it's set in Paris.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. Sort of Paris being so kind of culturally central, and that it's just completely erased. I hadn't sort of made that link in my head.
And especially with the have you seen the pictures of old Paris prior to the demolition of it? So you have this city in which these small medieval streets were being knocked down to create these sort of broad boulevards, and to go from something that is so pokey and perfect for a story like this. It's like the old Paris, where there's the shadows and the sort of human squalor that's been knocked down by these sort of projects associated with the creation of a new vision of what humanity is, which I think is something that Lovecraft had. He wrote about that sort of smug rationalism in his writing about of what makes horror horror relevant today. He wrote I can't remember what it's in. The essay is called Supernatural Horror in Literature, and he wrote that horror is horror stands up as a genre. Against it, I discharged all the shafts, and the feeling of fear itself. He said, against it, I discharged all the shafts of materialistic sophistication which clings to frequently felt emotions and external events, and are of naively insipid idealism, which deprecates the aesthetic motive and calls it for a didactic literature to uplift the reader towards a suitable degree of smirking optimism, which is definitely something that is definitely more of a theme, I think, in the Rats in the Walls, which we'll talk about next.
Oh, for sure, yeah, absolutely. Before I move on to the Rats in the Walls, I thought I'd briefly mention kind of, we've talked about obviously that kind of the themes of Lovecraftian horror, but also in terms of kind of the influence he's had. I sort of briefly touched on the fact that, alongside obviously Edgar Allan Poe, he's probably one of the most, if not the most influential writer on horror as a genre that we've had. So even say Stephen King, who's a kind of late 20th century giant of the horror genre, despite his massive kind of differences in political beliefs from the sort of understanding of Lovecraft, at least, King sort of massively respects Lovecraft as a horror writer. And you can sort of see some of those influences from Lovecraft, those sorts of themes in, say, the Tommyknockers, which is very much kind of almost like King's take on The Colour Out of Space, which is a Lovecraftian story. But also then if you look at something like It, in its kind of possibly coke-fueled King-esque ending where you suddenly end up in space and there's a turtle, because that's what cocaine does to you kids. At the same time, it is still engaging with that theme of this is a cosmic battle way beyond the scale that humans can conceive of. And he's not really interested in the kind of demonic clown in the sewers. That's just a sort of human representation of this much bigger conflict happening. And so I think you can see something deeply Lovecraftian in that. And one thing I also thought was quite interesting is because Lovecraft deals in sort of dreamscapes, lots of his short stories will feature these kind of otherworldly planes that are kind of somehow sort of spaces that shouldn't exist, uncanny spaces that, stairs where there weren't stairs before, or suddenly, underneath a house, we'll get to it in the Rats in the Walls, kind of what seems to be a cellar sort of opens up into this vast subterranean space. And his kind of interest in these sort of uncanny spaces and dreamscapes essentially kind of influenced a lot of visual artists of the 20th century, including, and this is one for kind of horror film fanatics out there, a visual artist called H.R. Geiger, who put together a book of paintings called Necronomicon, which is obviously directly referencing Lovecraft. But this book, Necronomicon, actually the art in it went on to inspire the creature design and the kind of world design for the film Alien. So there's a kind of direct link into, I wouldn't necessarily have initially thought of Alien as a particularly Lovecraftian influenced film, but actually the themes of the kind of smallness of humanity against these vast, inhuman and kind of unstoppable forces that they can't really fight against. I think you can sort of see, some of the things that interested Lovecraft cropping up in lots of different horror films in a way that sort of is more far-reaching than I think I'd at first thought. I have found a list on Wikipedia. If you look up Lovecraftian horror on Wikipedia, there's a whole list of films that both directly kind of interpret some of his works or kind of respond to his theories. Sam Raimi, for example, was studying Lovecraft and went on to create The Evil Dead, sort of directly inspired by Lovecraft. Well, not directly inspired, but sort of some of his reading kind of influenced the creation of The Evil Dead. There's obviously the Necronomicon again features in that, but then there's also things like, they just get possessed. It could have happened to anyone. It's kind of the futility, the sort of feebleness of humans in a way sort of comes up there. But yeah, before I move on to the Rats in the Walls, which is a beefy story and it might take about 40 minutes to read, so brace yourselves. I thought I'd quickly also mention, and Amy, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this as well, the sort of current hand-wringing about his political views. I mean, you said that they sort of changed over his lifetime. But I think one thing that anyone who's talked about Lovecraft or heard anyone talk about Lovecraft knows in the 21st century is he was a bigot. Nothing else kind of matters, but he was a bigot. And I read an article, a very hysterical article from NPR earlier, where they'd done a series of adaptations of his stories, but then had this kind of hand-wringing kind of, oh, we want to explain why, he was a horrible, horrible, awful person, but, we really think his influence on horror is really important, even if he's an awful person. And they took pains to point out various modern horror writers who are essentially making bank off Lovecraft's creations whilst divorcing them from the creator himself. This sort of article triumphantly talked about, various authors who've taken the sort of mythos of Cthulhu, but the real enemy in their stories is the bigotry of the original creator, which it sort of reminded me in a sort of current year version of the way that J.K. Rowling is being extracted from Harry Potter so that people can enjoy the books without having to think about the awful views of its creator, which just embarrasses me, frankly.
In his, Giant Art Productions did an episode of Digital Archipelago on Lovecraft, and he called it the Redditification of Lovecraft.
Oh, nice.
He thinks that it will be unsuccessful because it's just virtually impossible to ignore, especially in how prominent it is in some of his fiction. But I do think that a lot of it's not really the case in the books that we're covering, but a lot of the time in Lovecraft, the forbidden knowledge, it's the scholars, it's the sort of gentlemanly white class that have no ability to access this. It's mainly the sort of the Orientals or the Ellis Islanders are the ones who have access to this knowledge, this forbidden knowledge, and it is to some extent the sort of madness and squalor of these groups that have access to the knowledge are the ones who, in a sense, are more connected to reality. Like if we think about in the music of Erich Zann, he's studying, metaphysics, and for him, he said, "Oh, I tried to be nice to him, and I was really helped by my studies of metaphysics." And so that's the greatest accomplishment of philosophy is to be nice.
Yeah. It is fascinating seeing, as you say, it's kind of who are the people who have lost access to this knowledge and who are the people who kind of perhaps almost cause trouble and cause chaos by seeking it, I think is an interesting question to ask in a way. But I think I will do a brief disclaimer before I crack into the rats in the walls, because I've seen a few people in the comments ask about the cat question. Or the
I
cat
suggested
name question.
Sooty, which yes. I still think is quite a good one. But
Sooty is a good one. We were toying with this. I was thinking of suggesting, maybe calling it St. George, or some other slightly sarcastic name. However, for those who don't know, I froze there and there was a loud buzzing. Maybe Cthulhu was angry. There we go. Yes, so for those who aren't aware of the meme, one of the sometimes or frequent challenges with Lovecraft is he used very common language of his time. So I'm trying to think of a way to say this in a Susan-friendly manner. But essentially, you'll come across things. One of the reasons he gets accused of bigotry is because you'll come across language in his writing which is deemed inappropriate or offensive or sort of banned today. And that includes the name of a cat in this short story. And Susan, forgive me, bots, forgive me. The cat is called Nigger Man. which
Black cat.
it's a black cat. That's why. And we thought about it. To me, it's very important to present texts as they were originally written. You know, he's chosen that name for a reason. My cat is now yelling, so you might hear Gatsby in the background. He does not approve of the name. But yeah, essentially, I would have liked to just read it as it appears in the story. However, the cat is named 19 times in this text, and I don't trust Susan's bots, the sort of auto algorithm bots, to just not pick that up and go, well, someone is having a very offensive time over here. Let's just delete this channel. So I was toying between City. I liked City. We also thought of that lane somewhere in England that recently got renamed to be less offensive. So we've decided to call the cat Black Boy, after Black Boy Lane. But as I say, I would very much like to not have to do this. If the name cropped up maybe 3 times, I'd take the risk on Proper Horror Show's channel and let her risk a YouTube strike. But because it crops up 19 times, I am bowing to Susan's YouTube. So forgive me. So yes, I'll now read The Rats in the Walls. And as I said as well, it's quite a long one. So this might take a while. And I may have to send to holler for Proper Horror Show to get me some water halfway through so I don't die. But yes. So this was written in August and September 1923. And was inspired by passages in S. Baring Gould's Curious Myths of the Middle Ages and Fiona Macleod's The Sin Eater. Also at the end, there are some moments where the narrator speaks in Gaelic, so I can only apologise for my pronunciation when we get to that point. On July 16, 1923, I moved into Exham Priory after the last workman had finished his labours. The restoration had been a stupendous task, for little had remained of the deserted pile but a shell-like ruin. Yet because it had been the seat of my ancestors, I let no expense deter me. The place had not been inhabited since the reign of James I, when a tragedy of intensely hideous, though largely unexplained nature, had struck down the master, 5 of his children, and several servants, and driven forth under a cloud of suspicion and terror the 3rd son, my lineal progenitor, and the only survivor of the abhorred line. With this sole heir denounced as a murderer, the estate had reverted to the crown, nor had the accused man made any attempt to exculpate himself or regain his property. Shaken by some horror greater than that of conscience or the law, and expressing only a frantic wish to exclude the ancient edifice from his sight and memory, Walter de la Pure, 11th Baron Exham, fled to Virginia and there founded the family which by the next century had become known as Delaporte. Exham Priory had remained untenanted, though later allotted to the estates of the Norreys family, and much studied because of its peculiarly composite architecture, an architecture involving Gothic towers resting on a Saxon or Romanesque substructure, whose foundation in turn was of a still earlier order or blend of orders, Roman and even Druidic, or native Cymric, if legends speak truly. This foundation was a very singular thing, being merged on one side with the solid limestone of the precipice from whose brink the priory overlooked a desolate valley 3 miles west of the village of Anchester. Architects and antiquarians loved to examine this strange relic of forgotten centuries, but the country folk hated it. They had hated it hundreds of years before, when my ancestors lived there, and they hated it now, with the moss and mould of abandonment on it. I had not been a day in Anchester before I knew I came of an accursed house. And this week, workmen have blown up Exham Priory, and are busy obliterating the traces of its foundations. The bare statistics of my ancestry I had always known, together with the fact that my first American forebear had come to the colonies under a strange cloud. Of details, however, I had been kept wholly ignorant through the policy of reticence always maintained by the Delaportes. Unlike our planter neighbours, we seldom boasted of crusading ancestors or other medieval and Renaissance heroes, nor was any kind of tradition handed down, except what may have been recorded in the sealed envelope left before the Civil War by every squire to his eldest son for posthumous opening. The glories we cherished were those achieved since the migration, the glories of a proud and honourable, if somewhat reserved and unsocial Virginia line. During the war, our fortunes were extinguished and our whole existence changed by the burning of Carfax, our home on the banks of the James. My grandfather, advanced in years, had perished in that incendiary outrage, and with him the envelope that bound us all to the past. I can recall that fire today as I saw it then at the age of 7, with the Federal soldiers shouting, the women screaming, and the Negroes howling and praying. My father was in the army, defending Richmond, and after many formalities, my mother and I were passed through the line to join him. When the war ended, we all moved north, whence my mother had come, and I grew to manhood, middle age, and ultimate wealth as a stolid Yankee. Neither my father nor I ever knew what our hereditary envelope had contained, and as I merged into the greyness of Massachusetts business life, I lost all interest in the mysteries which evidently lurked far back in my family law tree. Had I suspected their nature, how gladly I would have left Exham Priory to its moss, bats, and cobwebs. My father died in 1904, but without any message to leave me, or to my only child, Alfred, a motherless boy of 10. It was this boy who reversed the order of family information, for although I could give him only jesting conjectures about the past, he wrote me of some very interesting ancestral legends when the late war took him to England in 1917 as an aviation officer. Apparently, the Delapours had a colourful and perhaps sinister history, for a friend of my son's, Captain Edward Norreys of the Royal Flying Corps, dwelt near the family seat at Anchester, and related some peasant superstitions which few novelists could equal for wildness and incredibility. Norreys himself, of course, did not take them seriously, but they amused my son and made good material for his letters to me. It was this legendary which definitely turned my attention to my transatlantic heritage, and made me resolve to purchase and restore the family seat which Norreys showed to Alfred in its picturesque desertion, and offered to get for him at a surprisingly reasonable figure, since his own uncle was the present owner. I bought Exham Priory in 1918, but was almost immediately distracted from my plans of restoration by the return of my son as a maimed invalid. During the 2 years that he lived, I thought of nothing but his care, having even placed my business under the direction of partners. In 1921, as I found myself bereaved and aimless, a retired manufacturer no longer young, I resolved to divert my remaining years with my new possession. Visiting Anchester in December, I was entertained by Captain Norreys, a plump, amiable young man who had thought much of my son, and secured his assistance in gathering plans and anecdotes to guide in the coming restoration. Exham Priory itself I saw without emotion, a jumble of tottering medieval ruins covered with lichens and honeycombed with rooks' nests, perched perilously upon a precipice, and denuded of floors or other interior features save the stone walls of the separate towers. As I gradually recovered the image of the edifice as it had been when my ancestor left it over 3 centuries before, I began to hire workmen for the reconstruction. In every case, I was forced to go outside the immediate locality, for the Anchester villagers had an almost unbelievable fear and hatred of the place. This sentiment was so great that it was sometimes communicated to the outside labourers, causing numerous desertions, while its scope appeared to include both the priory and its ancient family. My son had told me that he was somewhat avoided during his visits because he was a Delapour, and I now found myself subtly ostracised for a like reason until I convinced the peasants how little I knew of my heritage. Even then they sullenly disliked me, so that I had to collect most of the village traditions through the mediation of Norreys. What the people could not forgive, perhaps, was that I had come to restore a symbol so abhorrent to them, for, rationally or not, they viewed Exham Priory as nothing less than a haunt of fiends and werewolves. Piecing together the tales which Norreys collected for me, and supplementing them with the accounts of several savants who had studied the ruins, I deduced that Exham Priory stood on the site of a prehistoric temple, a druidical or anti-druidical thing which must have been contemporary with Stonehenge. That indescribable rites had been celebrated there, few doubted, and there were unpleasant tales of the transference of these rites into the Cybele worship which the Romans had introduced. Inscriptions still visible in the subcellar bore such unmistakable letters as Div, Ops, Magna Mat, sign of the Magna Mater whose dark worship was once vainly forbidden to Roman citizens. Anchester had been the camp of the 3rd Augustan Legion, as many remains attest, and it was said that the temple of Cybele, I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm going to say Cybele, was splendid and thronged with worshippers who performed nameless ceremonies at the bidding of a Phrygian priest. Tales added that the fall of the old religion did not end the orgies at the temple, but that the priests lived on in the new faith without real change. Likewise, it was said that the rites did not vanish with the Roman power, and that certain among the Saxons added to what remained of the temple and gave it the essential outline it subsequently preserved, making it the centre of a cult feared through half the Heptarchy. About 1000 AD, the place is mentioned in a chronicle as being a substantial stone priory housing a strange and powerful monastic order and surrounded by extensive gardens which needed no walls to exclude a frightened populace. It was never destroyed by the Danes, though after the Norman conquest it must have declined tremendously, since there was no impediment when Henry III granted the site to my ancestor, Gilbert de la Pere, 1st Baron Exham, in 1261. Of my family before this date there is no evil report, but something strange must have happened then. In one chronicle there is a reference to a de la Pere as cursed of God in 1307, whilst village legendary had nothing but evil and frantic fear to tell of the castle that went up on the foundations of the old temple and priory. The fireside tales were of the most grisly description, all the ghastlier because of their frightened reticence and cloudly evasiveness. They represented my ancestors as a race of hereditary demons, besides whom Gilles de Retz and the Marquis de Sade would seem the veriest tyros, and hinted whisperingly at their responsibility for the occasional disappearance of villagers throughout several generations. The worst characters, apparently, were the barons and their direct heirs. At least, most was whispered about these. If of healthier inclinations, it was said, an heir would early and mysteriously die to make way for another, more typical scion. There seemed to be an inner cult in the family, presided over by the head of the house, and sometimes closed except to a few members. Temperament rather than ancestry was evidently the basis of this cult, for it was entered by several who married into the family. Lady Margaret Trevor from Cornwall, wife of Godfrey, the second son of the 5th Baron, became a favourite bane of children all over the countryside, and the demon heroine of a particularly horrible old ballad not yet extinct near the Welsh border. Preserved in balladry too, though not illustrating the same point, is the hideous tale of Lady Mary de la Pere, who shortly after her marriage to the Earl of Shrewsfield was killed by him and his mother, both of the slayers being absolved and blessed by the priest to whom they confessed what they dared not repeat to the world. These myths and ballads, typical as they were of crude superstition, repelled me greatly. Their persistence and their application to so long a line of my ancestors was especially annoying, whilst the imputations of monstrous habits proved unpleasantly reminiscent of the one known scandal of my immediate forebears, the case of my cousin, young Randolph de la Pore of Carfax, who went among the Negroes and became a voodoo priest after he returned from the Mexican War. I was much less disturbed by the vague tales of wails and howlings in the Baron Windswept. I was much less disturbed by the vaguer tales of wails and howlings in the barren windswept valley beneath the limestone cliff, of the graveyard stenches after the spring rains, of the floundering, squealing white thing on which Sir John Clave's horse had trod one night in a lonely field, and of the servant who had gone mad at what he saw in the priory in the full light of day. These things were hackneyed spectral lore, and I was at that time a pronounced sceptic. The accounts of vanished peasants were less to be dismissed, though not especially significant in view of medieval custom. Prying curiosity meant death, and more than one severed head had been publicly shown on the bastions, now effaced, around Exham Priory. A few of the tales were exceedingly picturesque, and made me wish I had learnt more of comparative mythology in my youth. There was, for instance, the belief that a legion of bat-winged devils kept witches' Sabbath each night at the Priory, a legion whose sustenance might explain the disproportionate abundance of coarse vegetables harvested in the vast gardens. And, most vivid of all, there was the dramatic epic of the rats, the scampering army of obscene vermin which had burst forth from the castle 3 months after the tragedy that doomed it to desertion, the lean, filthy, ravenous army which had swept all before it and devoured fowl, cats, dogs, hogs, sheep, and even 2 hapless human beings before its fury was spent. Around that unforgettable rodent army, a whole separate cycle of myths revolves, for it scattered among the village homes and brought curses and horrors in its train. Such was the lore that assailed me as I pushed to completion with an elderly obstinacy, the work of restoring my ancestral home. It must not be imagined for a moment that these tales formed my principal psychological environment. On the other hand, I was constantly praised and encouraged by Captain Norreys and the antiquarians who surrounded and aided me. When the task was done, over 2 years after its commencement, I viewed the great rooms, wainscoted walls, vaulted ceilings, mullioned windows, and broad staircases with a pride which fully compensated for the prodigious expense of the restoration. Every attribute of the Middle Ages was cunningly reproduced, and the new parts blended perfectly with the original walls and foundations. The seat of my fathers was complete, and I looked forward to redeeming at last the local fame of the line which ended in me. I would reside here permanently, and prove that a de la Peur, for I had adopted again the original spelling of the name, need not be a fiend. My comfort was perhaps augmented by the fact that, although Exham Priory was medievally fitted, its interior was in truth wholly new and free from old vermin and old ghosts alike. As I have said, I moved in on July 16th, 1923. My household consisted of 7 servants and 9 cats, of which latter species I am particularly fond. My eldest cat, Black Boy, was 7 years old and had come with me from my home in Bolton, Massachusetts. The others I had accumulated whilst living with Captain Norreys' family during the restoration of the priory. For 5 days our routine proceeded with the utmost placidity, my time being spent mostly in the codification of old family data. I had now obtained some very circumstantial accounts of the final tragedy and flight of Walter de la Peur, which I conceived to be the probable contents of the hereditary paper lost in the fire at Carfax. It appears that my ancestor was accused, with much reason, of having killed all the other members of his household, except 4 servant confederates, in their sleep, about 2 weeks after a shocking discovery which changed his whole demeanour, but which, except by implication, he disclosed to no one save perhaps the servants who assisted him, and afterwards fled beyond reach. This deliberate slaughter, which included a father, 3 brothers, and 2 sisters, was largely condoned by the villagers, and so slackly treated by the law that its perpetrator escaped honoured, unharmed, and undisguised to Virginia, the general whispered sentiment being that he had purged the land of an immemorial curse. What discovery had prompted an act so terrible I could scarcely even conjecture. Walter de la Peur must have known for years the sinister tales about his family, so that this material could have given him no fresh impulse. Had he then witnessed some appalling ancient rite, or stumbled upon some frightful and revealing symbol in the priory or its vicinity? He was reputed to have been a shy, gentle youth in England. In Virginia he seemed not so much hard or bitter as harassed and apprehensive. He was spoken of in the diary of another gentleman adventurer, Francis Harley of Bellevue, as a man of unexampled justice, honour, and delicacy. On July the 22nd occurred the first incident which, though lightly dismissed at the time, takes on a preternatural significance in relation to latter events. It was so simple as to be almost negligible, and could not possibly have been noticed under the circumstances. For it must be recalled that since I was in a building practically fresh and new except for the walls, and surrounded by a well-balanced staff of servitors, apprehension would have been absurd despite the locality. What I afterward remembered is merely this, that my old black cat, whose moods I know so well, was undoubtedly alert and anxious to an extent wholly out of keeping with his natural character. He roved from room to room, restless and disturbed, and sniffed constantly about the walls which formed part of the old Gothic structure. I realise how trite this sounds, like the inevitable dog in a ghost story which always growls before his master sees the sheeted figure, yet I cannot consistently suppress it. The following day, a servant complained of restlessness among all the cats in the house. He came to me in my study, a lofty west room on the 2nd story, with groined arches, black oak panelling, and a triple Gothic window overlooking the limestone cliff and desolate valley. And even as he spoke, I saw the jetty form of Black Boy creeping along the west wall and scratching at the new panels which overlaid the ancient stone. I told the man that there must be some singular odour or emanation from the old stonework, imperceptible to human senses, but affecting the delicate organs of cats even through the new woodwork. This, I truly believed, and when the fellow suggested the presence of mice or rats, I mentioned that there had been no rats there for 300 years, and that even the field mice of the surrounding country could hardly be found in these high walls, where they had never been known to stray. That afternoon, I called on Captain Norreys, and he assured me that it would be quite incredible for field mice to infest the priory in such a sudden and unprecedented fashion. That night, dispensing as usual with a valet, I retired in the west tower chamber which I had chosen as my own, reached from the study by a stone staircase and short gallery, the former partly ancient, the latter entirely restored. This room was circular, very high, and without wainscoting, being hung with arras which I had myself chosen in London. Seeing that Black Boy was with me, I shut the heavy Gothic door and retired by the light of the electric bulbs which so cleverly counterfeited candles, finally switching off the light and sinking on the carved and canopied four-poster, with the venerable cat in his accustomed place across my feet. I did not draw the curtains, but gazed out at the narrow north window which I faced. There was a suspicion of aurora in the sky, and the delicate traceries of the window were pleasantly silhouetted. At some time I must have fallen quietly asleep, for I recall a distinct sense of having strange dreams, when the cat started violently from his placid position. I saw him in the faint auroral glow, head strained forward, 4 feet on my ankles, and hind feet stretched behind. He was looking intensely at a point on the wall somewhat west of the window, a point which to my eye had nothing to mark it, but toward which all my attention was now directed. And as I watched, I knew that Black Boy was not vainly excited. Whether the arras actually moved, I cannot say. I think it did, very slightly. But what I can swear to is that behind it I heard a low, distinct scurrying, as of rats or mice. In a moment, the cat had jumped bodily on the screening tapestry, bringing the affected section to the floor with his weight, and exposing a damp, ancient wall of stone, patched here and there by the restorers, and devoid of any trace of rodent prowlers. Black Boy raced up and down the floor by this part of the wall, clawing the fallen arras, and seemingly trying at times to insert a paw between the wall and the oaken floor. He found nothing, and after a time returned wearily to his place across my feet. I had not moved, but I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I questioned all the servants and found that none of them had noticed anything unusual, save that the cook remembered the actions of a cat which had rested on her windowsill. This cat had howled at some unknown hour of the night, awaking the cook in time for her to see him dart purposefully out of the open door down the stairs. I drowsed away the noontime, and in the afternoon called again on Captain Norreys, who became exceedingly interested in what I told him. The odd incidents, so slight yet so curious, appealed to his sense of the picturesque, and elicited from him a number of reminiscences of local ghostly lore. We were genuinely perplexed at the presence of rats, and Norreys lent me some traps and Paris green, which I had the servants place in strategic localities when I returned. I retired early, being very sleepy, but was harassed by dreams of the most horrible sort. I seemed to be looking down from an immense height upon a twilit grotto, knee-deep with filth, where a white-bearded demon swineherd drove about with his staff a flock of fungus, flabby beasts, whose appearance filled me with unutterable loathing. Then, as the swineherd paused and nodded over his task, a mighty swarm of rats rained down on the stinking abyss and fell to devouring beasts and man alike. From this terrific vision, I was awaked by the motions of Black Boy, who had been sleeping as usual across my feet. This time I did not have to question the source of his snarls and hisses, and of the fear which made him sink his claws into my ankle, unconscious of their effect, for on every side of the chamber the walls were alive with nauseous sound, the verminous slithering of ravenous, gigantic rats. There was now no aurora to show the state of the arras, the fallen section of which had been replaced, but I was not too frightened to switch on the light. As the bulbs leapt into radiance, I saw a hideous shaking all over the tapestry, causing the somewhat peculiar designs to execute a singular dance of death. This motion disappeared almost at once, and the sound with it. Springing out of bed, I poked at the arras with the long handle of a warming pan that rested near, and lifted one section to see what lay beneath. There was nothing but the patched stone wall, and even the cat had lost his tense realization of abnormal presences. When I examined the circular trap that had been placed in the room, I found all of the openings sprung, though no trace remained of what had been caught and had escaped. Further sleep was out of the question, so, lighting a candle, I opened the door and went out in the gallery towards the stairs to my study, Black Boy following at my heels. Before we had reached the stone steps, however, the cat darted ahead of me and vanished down the ancient flight. As I descended the stairs myself, I became suddenly aware of sounds in the great room below, sounds of a nature which could not be mistaken. The oak-panelled walls were alive with rats, scampering and milling, whilst Black Boy was racing about with the fury of a baffled hunter. Reaching the bottom, I switched on the light, which did not this time cause the noise to subside. The rats continued their riot, stampeding with such force and distinctness that I could finally assign to their motions a definite direction. These creatures, in numbers apparently inexhaustible, were engaged in one stupendous migration from inconceivable heights to some depth, conceivably or inconceivably below. I now heard steps in the corridor, and in another moment 2 servants pushed open the massive door. They were searching the house for some unknown source of disturbance which had thrown all the cats into a snarling panic and caused them to plunge precipitately down several flights of stairs and squat, yowling, before the closed door to the subcellar. I asked them if they had heard the rats, but they replied in the negative. And when I turned to call their attention to the sounds in the panels, I realized that the noise had ceased. With the 2 men, I went down to the door of the subcellar, but found the cats had already dispersed. Later, I resolved to explore the crypt below, but for the present I merely made a round of the traps. All were sprung, yet all were tenantless. Satisfying myself that no one had heard the rats save the felines and me, I sat in my study till morning, thinking profoundly, and recalling every scrap of legend I had unearthed concerning the building I inhabited. I slept some in the forenoon, leaning back in the one comfortable library chair which my medieval plan of furnishing could not banish. Later, I telephoned to Captain Norreys, who came over and helped me explore the subcellar. Absolutely nothing untoward was found, although we could not repress a thrill at the knowledge that this vault was built by Roman hands. Every low arch and massive pillar was Roman, not the debased Romanesque of the bungling Saxons, but the severe and harmonious classicism of the age of the Caesars. Indeed, the walls abounded with inscriptions familiar to the antiquarians who had repeatedly explored the place. Things like P. Getae Prop, Temp, Dona, and El Praec, Vies, Pontifi, Attis. The reference to Attis made me shiver, for I had read Catullus and knew something of the hideous rites of the Eastern god whose worship was so mixed with that of Cybele. Norreys and I, by the light of lanterns, tried to interpret the odd and nearly effaced designs on certain irregularly rectangular blocks of stone generally held to be altars, but could make nothing of them. We remembered that one pattern, a sort of rayed sun, was held by students to imply a non-Roman origin, suggesting that these altars had merely been adopted by the Roman priests from some older and perhaps aboriginal temple on the same site. On one of these blocks were some brown stains which made me wonder. The largest, in the centre of the room, had certain features on the upper surface which indicated its connection with fire, probably burnt offerings. Such were the sights in that crypt before whose door the cats had howled, and where Norreys and I now determined to pass the night. Couches were brought down by the servants, who were told not to mind any nocturnal actions of the cats, and Black Boy was admitted as much for help as for companionship. We decided to keep the great oak door, a modern replica with slits for ventilation, tightly closed, and with this attended to, we retired with lanterns still burning to await whatever might occur. The vault was very deep in the foundations of the priory, and undoubtedly far down on the face of the beetling limestone cliff overlooking the waste valley. That it had been the goal of the scuffling and unexplainable rats I could not doubt, though why I could not tell. As we lay there expectantly, I found my vigil occasionally mixed with half-formed dreams, from which the uneasy motions of the cat across my feet would rouse me. These dreams were not wholesome, but horribly like the one I had had the night before. I saw again the twilit grotto, and the swineherd with his unmentionable fungus beasts wallowing in filth, and as I looked at these things they seemed nearer and more distinct, so distinct that I could almost observe their features. Then I did observe the flabby features of one of them, and awaked with such a scream that Black Boy started up, whilst Captain Norreys, who had not slept, laughed considerably. Norreys might have laughed more, or perhaps less, had he known what it was that made me scream. But I did not remember myself till later. Ultimate horror often paralyzes memory in a merciful way. Norreys waked me when the phenomena began. Out of the same frightful dream I was called by his gentle shaking and his urging to listen to the cats. Indeed, there was much to listen to, for beyond the closed door at the head of the stone steps was a veritable nightmare of feline yelling and clawing, whilst Black Boy, unmindful of his kindred outside, was running excitedly around the bare stone walls, in which I heard the same babble of scurrying rats that had troubled me the night before. An acute terror now rose within me, for here were anomalies which nothing normal could well explain. These rats, if not the creatures of a madness which I shared with the cats alone, must be burrowing and sliding in Roman walls I had thought to be of solid limestone blocks. Unless, perhaps, the action of water through more than 17 centuries had eaten winding tunnels of which rodent bodies had worn clear and ample. But even so, the spectral horror was no less, for if these were living vermin, why did not Norreys hear their disgusting commotion? Why did he urge me to watch Black Boy and listen to the cats outside? And why did he guess wildly and vaguely at what could have aroused them? By the time I had managed to tell him, as rationally as I could, what I thought I was hearing, my ears gave me the last fading impression of the scurrying, which had retreated still downward, far underneath this deepest of subcellars, till it seemed as if the whole cliff below were riddled with questing rats. Norreys was not as sceptical as I had anticipated, but instead seemed profoundly moved. He motioned to me to notice that the cats at the door had ceased their clamour, as if giving up the rats for lost, whilst Black Boy had a burst of renewed restlessness and was clawing frantically around the bottom of the large stone altar in the centre of the room, which was nearer Norreys' couch than mine. My fear of the unknown was at this point very great. Something astounding had occurred, and I saw that Captain Norreys, a younger, stouter, and presumably more naturally materialistic man, was affected fully as much as myself, perhaps because of his lifelong and intimate familiarity with local legend. We could for the moment do nothing but watch the old black cat as he pawed with decreasing fervour at the base of the altar, occasionally looking up and mewing to me in that persuasive manner which he used when he wished me to perform some favour for him. Norreys now took a lantern close to the altar and examined the place where Black Boy was pawing, silently kneeling and scraping away the lichens of centuries which joined the massive pre-Roman block to the tessellated floor. He did not find anything, and was about to abandon his effort, when I noticed a trivial circumstance which made me shudder, even though it implied nothing more than I had already imagined. I told him of it, and we both looked at its almost imperceptible manifestation, with the fixedness of fascinated discovery and acknowledgement. It was only this, that the flame of the lantern set down near the altar was slightly but certainly flickering from a draught of air which it had not before received, and which came indubitably from the crevice between floor and altar where Norreys was scraping away the lichens. We spent the rest of the night in the brilliantly lighted study, nervously discussing what we should do next. The discovery that some vault deeper than the deepest known masonry of the Romans underlay this accursed pile, some vault unsuspected by the curious antiquarians of 3 centuries, would have been sufficient to excite us without any background of the sinister. As it was, the fascination became twofold, and we paused in doubt whether to abandon our search and quit the priory forever in superstitious caution, or to gratify our sense of adventure and brave whatever horrors might await us in the unknown depths. By morning, we had compromised, and decided to go to London to gather a group of archaeologists and scientific men to cope with the mystery. It should be mentioned that before leaving the subcellar, we had vainly tried to move the central altar, which we now recognised as the gate to a new pit of nameless fear. What secret would open the gate, wiser men than we would have to find. During many days in London, Captain Norreys and I presented our facts, conjectures, and legendary anecdotes to 5 eminent authorities, all men who could be trusted to respect any family disclosures which future explorations might develop. We found most of them little disposed to scoff, but instead intensely interested and sincerely sympathetic. It is hardly necessary to name them all, but I may say that they included Sir William Brinton, whose excavations in the Troad excited most of the world in their day. As we all took the train for Anchester, I felt myself poised on the brink of frightful revelations, a sensation symbolised by the air of mourning among the many Americans at the unexpected death of the President on the other side of the world. On the evening of August the 7th, we reached Exham Priory, where the servants assured me that nothing unusual had occurred. The cats, even old Black Boy, had been perfectly placid, and not a trap in the house had been sprung. We were to begin exploring on the following day, awaiting which I assigned well-appointed rooms to all my guests. I myself retired in my own tower chamber, with Black Boy across my feet. Sleep came quickly, but hideous dreams assailed me. There was a vision of a Roman feast like that of Trimalchio, with horror in a covered platter. Then came that damnable recurrent thing about the swineherd and his filthy drove in the twilit grotto. Yet when I awoke it was full daylight, with normal sounds in the house below. The rats, living or spectral, had not troubled me, and Black Boy was quietly asleep. On going down, I found that the same tranquillity had prevailed elsewhere, a condition which one of the assembled savants, a fellow named Thornton, devoted to the psychic, rather absurdly laid to the fact that I had now been shown the thing which certain forces had wished to show me. All was now ready, and at 11 a.m. our entire group of 7 men, bearing powerful electric searchlights and implements of excavation, went down to the sub-cellar and bolted the door behind us. Black Boy was with us, for the investigators found no occasion to despise his excitability, and were indeed anxious that he be present in case of obscure rodent manifestations. We noted the Roman inscriptions and unknown altar designs only briefly, for 3 of the savants had already seen them, and all knew their characteristics. Prime attention was paid to the momentous central altar, and within an hour Sir William Brinton had caused it to tilt backwards, balanced by some unknown species of counterweight. There now lay revealed such a horror as would have overwhelmed us had we not been prepared. Through a nearly square opening in the tiled floor, sprawling on a flight of stone steps so prodigiously worn that it was little more than an inclined plane at the centre, was a ghastly array of human or semi-human bones. Those which retained their collocation as skeletons showed attitudes of panic fear, and over all were the marks of rodent gnawing. The skulls denoted nothing short of utter idiocy, cretinism, or primitive semi-apedom. Above the hellishly littered steps arched a descending passage seemingly chiselled from the solid rock and conducting a current of air. This current was not a sudden and noxious rush as from a closed vault, but a cool breeze with something of freshness in it. We did not pause long, but shiveringly began to clear a passage down the steps. It was then that Sir William, examining the hewn walls, made the odd observation that the passage, according to the direction of the strokes, must have been chiselled from beneath. I must be very deliberate now, and choose my words. After ploughing down a few steps amidst the gnawed bones, we saw that there was light ahead. Not any mystic phosphorescence, but a filtered daylight which could not come except from unknown fissures in the cliff that overlooked the waste valley. That such fissures had escaped notice from outside was hardly remarkable, for not only is the valley wholly uninhabited, but the cliff is so high and beetling that only an aeronaut could study its face in detail. A few steps more, and our breaths were literally snatched from us by what we saw, so literally that Thornton, the psychic investigator, actually fainted in the arms of the dazed man who stood behind him. Norris, his plump face utterly white and flabby, simply cried out inarticulately, whilst I think that what I did was to gasp or hiss and cover my eyes. The man behind me, the only one of the party older than I, croaked the hackneyed, "My God," in the most cracked voice I ever heard. Of 7 cultivated men, only Sir William Brinton retained his composure, a thing more to his credit because he led the party and must have seen the sight first. It was a twilit grotto of enormous height, stretching away farther than any eye could see, a subterraneous world of limitless mystery and horrible suggestion. There were buildings and other architectural remains, In one terrified glance, I saw a weird pattern of tumuli, a savage circle of monoliths, a low-domed Roman ruin, a sprawling Saxon pile, an early English edifice of wood. But all these were dwarfed by the ghoulish spectacle presented by the general surface of the ground. For yards about the steps extended an insane tangle of human bones, or bones at least as human as those on the steps. Like a foamy sea they stretched, some fallen apart, but others wholly or partly articulated as skeletons. These latter invariably in postures of demonic frenzy, either fighting off some menace or clutching other forms with cannibal intent. When Dr. Trask, the anthropologist, stooped to classify the skulls, he found a degraded mixture which utterly baffled him. They were mostly lower than the Piltdown man in the scale of evolution, but in every case definitely human. Many were of higher grade, and a very few were the skulls of supremely and sensitively developed types. All the bones were gnawed, mostly by rats, but somewhat by others of the half-human drove. Mixed with them were many tiny bones of rats, fallen members of the lethal army which closed the ancient epic. I wonder that any man among us lived and kept his sanity through that hideous day of discovery. Not Hoffmann or Huysmans could conceive a scene more wildly incredible, more frenetically repellent, or more gothically grotesque than the twilit grotto through which we seven staggered, each stumbling on revelation after revelation, and trying to keep for the nonce from thinking of the events which must have taken place there 300 years, or 1,000, or 2,000, or 10,000 years ago. It was the antechamber of hell, and poor Thornton fainted again when Trask told him that some of the skeleton things must have descended as quadrupeds through the last 20 or more generations. Horror piled on horror as we began to interpret the architectural remains. The quadruped things, with their occasional recruits from the biped class, had been kept in stone pens, out of which they must have broken in their last delirium of hunger or rat fear. There had been great herds of them, evidently fattened on the coarse vegetables, whose remains could be found as a sort of poisonous ensilage at the bottom of huge stone bins older than Rome. I knew now why my ancestors had had such excessive gardens. Would to heaven I could forget. The purpose of the herds I did not have to ask. Sir William, standing with his searchlight in the Roman ruin, translated aloud the most shocking ritual I have ever known, and told of the diet of the antediluvian cult which the priests of Cybele found and mingled with their own. Norreys, used as he was to the trenches, could not walk straight when he came out of the English building. It was a butcher shop and kitchen. He had expected that, but it was too much to see familiar English implements in such a place, and to read familiar English graffiti there, some as recent as 1610. I could not go in that building whose demon activities were stopped only by the dagger of my ancestor, Walter de la Pore. What I did venture to enter was the low Saxon building whose oaken door had fallen, and there I found a terrible row of 10 stone cells with rusty bars. 3 had tenants, all skeletons of high grade, and on the bony forefinger of one I found a seal ring with my own coat of arms. Sir William found a vault with far older cells below the Roman chapel, but these cells were empty. Below them was a low crypt with cases of formally arranged bones, some of them bearing terrible parallel inscriptions carved in Latin, Greek, and the tongue of Phrygia. Meanwhile, Dr. Trask had opened one of the prehistoric tumuli and brought to light skulls which were slightly more human than a gorilla's, and which bore indescribable ideographic carvings. Through all this horror, my cat stalked unperturbed. Once I saw him monstrously perched atop a mountain of bones, and wondered at the secrets that might lie behind his yellow eyes. Having grasped, to some slight degree, the frightful revelations of this twilight area, an area so hideously foreshadowed by my recurrent dream, we turned to that apparently boundless depth of midnight cavern where no ray of light from the cliff could penetrate. We shall never know what sightless Stygian worlds yawn beyond the little distance we went, for it was decided that such secrets are not good for mankind. But there was plenty to engross us close at hand, for we had not gone far before the searchlights showed that accursed infinity of pits in which the rats had feasted, and whose sudden lack of replenishment had driven the ravenous Roman army first to turn on the living herds of starving things, and then to burst forth from the priory in that historic orgy of devastation which the peasants will never forget. God, those carrion black pits of sword-picked bones and open skulls, those nightmare chasms choked with the pithecanthropoid, Celtic, Roman, and English bones of countless unhallowed centuries. Some of them were full, and none can say how deep they had once been. Others were still bottomless to our searchlights and peopled by unnameable fancies. What, I thought, of the hapless rats that stumbled into such traps amid the blackness of their quests in this grisly Tartarus? Once, my foot slipped near a horribly yawning brink, and I had a moment of ecstatic fear. I must have been musing a long time, for I could not see any of the party but the plump Captain Norreys. Then there came a sound from that inky, boundless, farther distance that I thought I knew, and I saw my old black cat dart past me like a winged Egyptian god, straight into the illimitable gulf of the unknown. But I was not far behind, for there was no doubt after another second. It was the eldritch scurrying of those fiend-born rats, always questing for new horrors, and determined to lead me on even unto those grinning caverns of the earth's centre, where Nyarlathotep, the mad, faceless god, howls blindly to the piping of two amorphous, idiot flute players. My searchlight expired, but still I ran. I heard voices and yowls and echoes, but above all there gently rose that impious, insidious scurrying, gently rising, as a stiff, bloated corpse gently rises above an oily river that flows under endless onyx bridges to a black, putrid sea. Something bumped into me, something soft and plump. It must have been the rats, the viscous, gelatinous, ravenous army that feast on the dead and the living. Why shouldn't rats eat a Delapeur as a Delapeur eats forbidden things? The war ate my boy, damn them all. And the Yanks ate Carfax with flames and burnt Grandsire Delapeur and the secret. No, I tell you, I am not that demon swineherd in the Twilight Grotto. It was not Edward Norrie's fat face on that flabby fungus thing. Who says I am a Delapeur? He lived, but my boy died. Shall a Norris hold the lands of a Delapeur? It's voodoo, I tell you. That spotted snake. Curse you, Thornton, I'll teach you to faint at what my family do. Sblood, thou stinkard, I'll learn ye how to gust. Would ye swinke me thilkewis? Magna Mater, Attis. Dia adagaeth adaodan, agus badu nach ort, thonas ort, agus leatsa. Ungh. That is what they say I said when they found me in the blackness after 3 hours. Found me crouching in the blackness over the plump, half-eaten body of Captain Norris, with my own cat leaping and tearing at my throat. Now they have blown up Exham Priory, taken my black boy away from me, and shut me into this barred room at Hanwell with fearful whispers about my heredity and experiences. Thornton is in the next room, but they prevent me from talking to him. They are trying, too, to suppress most of the facts concerning the Priory. When I speak of poor Norreys, they accuse me of a hideous thing, but they must know that I did not do it. They must know it was the rats, the slithering, scurrying rats whose scampering will never let me sleep, the demon rats that race behind the padding in this room and beckon me down to greater horrors than I have ever known. The rats they can never hear. The rats in the walls. I'm loving chat just asking if I've summoned a chthonic entity. That was fun. Longer than I thought it was.
Yes.
Yes. I'm always really awkward at the end of these streams. I never quite know how to finish them.
What do you think of that one?
It's a very slow build-up. It took me quite a while at first to work out that no one else could see the rats. And then, yeah, I think there's there's the interesting thing that I find with some, certainly Lovecraft interpretations, where you can't quite be sure if it's all in that person's head or if they did actually see something monstrous and otherworldly. And I think Lovecraft wants us to know that, that he did see it and it was real. But there is that sort of uncanny thing where everyone's now going, no, you're mad, we'll just shut you away and pretend that we haven't seen this thing going on.
So he's the only one that can unlock it.
Yeah, that it's him coming back to the ancestral home means that they can get back in there and they can get back to the sort of rituals and understand what was happening.
I know that Lovecraft himself thought that when it came to an appreciation of horror and of a fear of the macabre, it was only, at least amongst his generation, it was something that most people were so lacking in imagination that they couldn't even like access these fears, and they just thought it was distasteful. And I can certainly understand why you'd see something like this as like gratuitous or distasteful, although he does leave a lot of it to the imagination. But it does it does go on to the idea of horror is teaching us things that we try to suppress, and that it kind of was with here in that it's the locals, it's the sort of it's the uncultured, uneducated village people who are the ones who are aware of this myths, and where they're like when they go to investigate, they get in the antiquarians and the archaeologists and the scientists, whereas obviously Lovecraft himself, he wasn't a religious man, but he does see the impulse towards horror and the impulse towards horror as something as a sister to the impulse towards religion, and that folklore developed alongside religion to incorporate what religion could or would not.
Yeah.
And I think that's, you get this is quite interesting with the mention of the grotto, calling it a grotto, and the mention of the picturesque, which Lovecraft was quite like disparaging towards a lot of the sort of early Gothic horror, the early from the Romantic period. He seemed to think it was quite like trite and sentimental. And the mentioning of the grotto and of the picturesque, although it was set after the Second World War in the 20th century, these are sort of phenomena associated with like that genre of literature, what was going on in the culture at the time during Romanticism, where these people would have these faux ancient grottos built, and like follies. The picturesque, and the like Turner painted a lot of the abbeys of the ruins, and you sort of sentimental, oh, isn't it nice how time passes kind of stuff. Whereas these sort of dabblers and dilettantes, compared to the sort of more the more intuitive knowledge of the locals.
For sure. I think that sort of makes me think of two things. The first was that in many ways, the way it's written, it felt like it could have been written a century previously, because this was from the sort of 20s or early 30s, I think. But it felt like something out of the early 19th century, or sort of maybe sort of slightly more perhaps closer to Dickens in tone. The sort of the narrator and the language doesn't feel like something from the early 20th century to me. And a lot of that, it made me think very much of Edgar Allan Poe and, for example, the Fall of the House of Usher. That's
he uses a lot of like archaic spellings as well.
Yeah, like show but with an E, and that kind of thing. And it felt slightly kind of out of time in a way, just as a piece of literature. And then yes, I think he did seem to be. Well, I found it interesting, the sort of the contrast between, I suppose, what the peasants instinctively know. They couldn't necessarily say for certain what had been going on in the basement below the basement below the basement, but they knew something wrong was there, and they knew enough to be deeply fearful of that family. But he's incredibly dismissive of them, and so is, sort of, as you say, the kind of educated classes essentially dismiss them actually at their peril. I don't quite know what to make of that, but I think from the sort of few other stories of his I've read, I wonder if that's a bit of a theme for him of, the sort of...
It certainly is a similar dynamic with regards to the racial aspects of a lot of his later work.
Yeah. It's making me want to read more.
I once fell asleep listening to this, which is I'm really bad at falling asleep in the points of like books or films in which they fall. Like I fell asleep when she fell asleep in Rosemary's Baby, and then I woke up the next day and it wasn't on Netflix anymore. So I never found out what happened. I had to Google it, and it's like, oh, that's when she was impregnated with the demon baby. It's like, oh, I hope I'm not now impregnated with demon baby. And I fell asleep listening to the Rats in the Walls on audiobook. And woke up where he's like making all those like weird, unintelligible noises. So woke up there,
yeah, thinking, that must have been...
Woke up screaming.
That must have been alarming for sure. That bit did... I thought we'd picked stories that didn't have any particularly excitable language in them in terms of things that you can't pronounce. And then discovered that, that last bit of speech, it goes sort of modern English, then into sort of a slightly older dialect, then into, I think, Middle English, then into Gaelic. And I was like, I can't. I'm doing my best here, guys, but I apologise for the Gaelic pronunciation because that's not a language I know.
It's a complete degeneration.
And it's also, it's interesting that he's sort of reverting back up the sort of centuries of his family. Because he's talked a lot about the sort of the pre-Roman culture and cult. And so, I think it's the language degenerates as he's kind of getting sucked back into that.
It will always be a part of him.
For sure.
Like physically as well. If it's cannibalism, the physical consumption of human flesh, which is then transformed by your own body into your own flesh and passed down from generation to generation. That's a nice thought. I hope everyone sleeps well tonight.
I was going to say, that's a lovely thought to leave it on. Just consume flesh. But yes, thank you very much for joining me on the stream. And in 2 weeks' time, we'll be doing a similar thing, but over on Amy's channel. So we hope to see lots of people there.
I thought... This could be wrong. I'm sorry for saying this live on stream. I just realised I probably shouldn't say this live on stream, but I thought next week was it, and then after that it'll be every 2 weeks.
Oh, okay.
Am I wrong? We'll talk about this later. I'm sorry.
That's absolutely
blabbermouth.
I'm trying to remember what we'd said. So we will share links and things when we know what date and where
we know,
and when we have finished consuming human flesh. And other than that, thanks everyone, and hope you enjoyed the stories.